When you think of crime in America, you probably picture a suspect in a police lineup or a defendant sitting in a courtroom dock. But some of the most devastating crimes ever committed in this country didn't happen on street corners or in dark alleys. They happened in boardrooms, in corporate offices. And the victims, thousands of them, didn't even know they were being victimized until it was too late. Between 2020 and 2025, the Securities and Exchange Commission prosecuted over 1,200 corporate fraud cases. Companies knowingly poisoned consumers. They lied to regulators. They buried evidence that could have saved lives. And when they got caught, the legal battles that followed were nothing short of epic. This is the verdict room, and today we're examining 7 of the most ruthless corporate crimes in American history. Cases that didn't just result in guilty verdicts, but in legal reforms that still shape how we regulate big business today. Let's start with the crime that killed millions. In the 1950s, the tobacco industry knew something the American public didn't. They knew that cigarettes caused cancer. They had the research, the science was clear, but instead of warning consumers, the major tobacco corporations, Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, Lorillard, and others, made a calculated decision. They launched a coordinated campaign to create doubt about the link between smoking and disease. They called it the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. What it really was, a criminal conspiracy to defraud the American people. For decades, tobacco executives testified under oath that they didn't believe cigarettes caused cancer, even as their own internal documents told a different story. Memos from Philip Morris scientists stated bluntly, "It is now believed that the occurrence of cancer of the lung, larynx, and bladder, and of coronary heart disease, is significantly higher in smokers than in non-smokers." That memo was dated 1954, yet in 1994, 7 tobacco executives testified before Congress that they didn't believe nicotine was addictive. It was perjury on a massive scale. The legal reckoning came in stages. Individual lawsuits piled up, some resulting in massive verdicts for plaintiffs who developed lung cancer. But the breakthrough came in 1998 with the Master Settlement Agreement. 46 states sued the tobacco industry for the cost of treating smoking-related diseases. The result, $206 billion in payments over 25 years, plus restrictions on advertising and marketing. For the first time, a corporate entity faced consequences that actually mattered. Consequences measured in the billions of dollars. Now let's shift to 2015. Volkswagen. The German automotive giant had built its reputation on quality and environmental responsibility. Their slogan was Das Auto, the car. But what they were actually doing was something far more sinister. VW engineers designed their diesel engines with a special feature: software that could detect when the car was being tested for emissions. During testing, the software would activate pollution controls, making the vehicle appear to meet EPA standards. But on the actual road, where 99% of driving happens, that software would shut off, allowing the engine to emit nitrogen oxides at levels up to 40 times higher than federal limits. It was fraud, plain and simple. When the EPA and regulators at West Virginia University discovered this, they were stunned. Volkswagen had installed this defeat device in approximately 11 million vehicles worldwide. The cover-up was methodical. Internal emails showed that VW engineers and executives knew about the problem for years. They discussed it in meetings. They calculated the cost of fixing it versus the cost of getting caught. And they chose to let people breathe toxic emissions. The legal fallout was catastrophic for VW. In 2016 and 2017, the company pleaded guilty to criminal charges and agreed to pay $14.7 billion in settlements. CEO Martin Winterkorn faced criminal charges in Germany, later dropped for his role in the conspiracy. The scandal cost VW roughly 30% of its market value, and it exposed a fundamental truth: corporations will cut corners and lie to regulators if the math says it's profitable to do so. But sometimes the fraud isn't about pollution or products. Sometimes it's about pure deception at the point of sale. In 2016, regulators began investigating Wells Fargo, one of America's largest banks. What they found was staggering. Between 2002 and 2015, Wells Fargo employees opened approximately 3.5 million unauthorized bank and credit card accounts without customer consent. Customers were charged fees on accounts they didn't know existed. Their credit scores were damaged. The bank was committing identity theft on an industrial scale. Here's what makes this case remarkable from a legal standpoint. This wasn't a few rogue employees acting without oversight. Internal investigations later revealed that Wells Fargo's compensation structure explicitly incentivized workers to open these fake accounts. The system was designed to reward fraud. Employees who questioned the practice were fired. The corruption came from the top. By 2018, Wells Fargo agreed to pay $3 billion in criminal and civil penalties. At the time, the largest settlement ever imposed on a U.S. bank. CEO John Stumpf was forced to resign and faced criminal charges. The board faced shareholder lawsuits. And crucially, the case exposed how internal compliance systems at major financial institutions had completely broken down. It raised an uncomfortable question. If a company of Wells Fargo's size and sophistication could commit fraud on this scale, how many other corporations are doing the same thing right now? Now let's turn to a crisis that has devastated American communities in ways we're still trying to comprehend. The opioid epidemic didn't start with street dealers. It started in the offices of Purdue Pharma, the manufacturer of OxyContin. In the 1990s, Purdue launched an aggressive marketing campaign claiming that oxycodone, a powerful Schedule II narcotic, had a low risk of addiction. It was a lie. The company knew it was a lie. Purdue funded research that downplayed addiction risks. They paid doctors to speak at promotional events. They minimized the dangers in marketing materials sent to physicians. Between 1999 and 2019, over 400,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses. Purdue Pharma's deception was a significant driver of that death toll. The company made $35 billion in revenue from OxyContin alone. They knew, from their own internal documents, that they were fueling an addiction crisis. And they continued anyway. The legal battle took nearly 2 decades to fully resolve. Purdue faced lawsuits from state attorneys general, municipalities, and individuals. In 2020, the company filed for bankruptcy and agreed to pay $8 billion in settlements. The Sackler family, which owned Purdue, faced personal lawsuits and public vilification. But here's the crucial legal detail. The company and the family largely maintained that they didn't bear sole responsibility for the opioid crisis. That doctors overprescribed, that patients misused medication, that the problem was more complex than simple corporate fraud. Whether you agree with that argument or not, the case established a powerful precedent. Pharmaceutical companies can and will be held accountable for knowing deception about drug risks. And in 2026, we're still seeing the ripple effects as cities and counties continue to pursue settlements against opioid manufacturers. Let's move to a case that took decades to fully expose: Johnson & Johnson and baby powder. For over a century, Johnson & Johnson sold talcum powder with an implicit promise. It was safe for your body. It was used on babies. It was marketed as a gentle, natural product. But in the 1970s, Johnson & Johnson's own scientists discovered something alarming. Talc could potentially cause ovarian cancer if used on the genital area. The company knew this, and they spent decades quietly reformulating their product while reassuring consumers that everything was fine. Starting in 2016, juries in multiple states began hearing cases from women who claimed talc caused their ovarian cancer. The evidence was compelling. Internal memos showed J&J understood the risk. The company had considered adding warnings, but doing so would have meant admitting the risk existed, which would have tanked sales. So instead, they stayed silent and let women continue using the product without informed consent. J&J eventually paid out over $9 billion in settlements, though the company continues to dispute the science linking talc to cancer. What makes this case legally significant is that it demonstrates how corporate negligence, failing to warn consumers of known risks, can result in staggering financial liability. And it raises the question, how many products are sitting on shelves right now where companies know about potential risks but haven't disclosed them? Now let's talk about a fraud so audacious, so brazenly deceptive, that it reads like a Hollywood script. Elizabeth Holmes founded Theranos in 2003 with a revolutionary promise: a device called the Edison that could run thousands of blood tests from a single drop of blood. It was groundbreaking. It was the future of medicine. Except it didn't work. The Edison couldn't perform the tests it claimed to perform. The accuracy was questionable. But Holmes didn't let little things like reality get in the way of her ambitions. Theranos falsified validation reports. It misled investors about the device's capabilities. It deceived patients and doctors about test results. At one point, Theranos had a $9 billion valuation. Major retailers like Walgreens partnered with the company. Investors poured in millions, all based on a technology that simply did not function as advertised. In 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was convicted of 4 counts of fraud and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 11 years in prison. The trial became a landmark case in tech fraud, establishing that Silicon Valley entrepreneurs aren't immune to criminal liability when they engage in systematic deception. And as of June 2026, Theranos continues to face civil lawsuits from investors seeking to recover billions in losses. Finally, let's examine a case that sits at the intersection of design negligence and manslaughter. In the 1970s, Ford Motor Company was designing the Pinto, a compact car intended to compete with Japanese imports. The engineering team faced a problem. The fuel tank was positioned in a way that made it vulnerable to ruptures in rear-end collisions. Ford engineers ran a cost-benefit analysis. They calculated that fixing the design would cost approximately $11 per vehicle. They calculated that the resulting injury settlements from accidents would cost less. So they chose not to fix it. Between 1971 and 1980, the Pinto was involved in dozens of rear-end collisions that resulted in fires, burn injuries, and deaths. Parents watched their children burn alive because of a design flaw that Ford knew about and chose not to address. The legal consequences were severe. Ford faced hundreds of lawsuits. Multiple criminal prosecutions for reckless endangerment were brought against the company. In 1980, a jury in Indiana found Ford guilty of reckless homicide in a case involving 3 teenage girls who died in a Pinto fire. Although Ford's conviction in that case was later overturned on technical grounds, the Pinto case fundamentally changed how we think about corporate liability. It established that companies can't simply run a cost-benefit analysis that favors profits over human lives. It demonstrated that the legal system could and would pursue criminal charges, not just civil settlements, against corporations that knowingly endanger people. So what do these 7 cases tell us about corporate crime in America? First, they tell us that the most dangerous crimes often aren't committed with guns or violence. They're committed in boardrooms, in spreadsheets, in calculated decisions to prioritize profits over people. Second, they tell us that when caught, corporations often face penalties measured in billions. Amounts that, while significant, often pale in comparison to the revenue generated by the criminal conduct. But third, and most importantly, these cases tell us that legal accountability matters. Every case we've discussed today resulted in reforms. The tobacco industry is now heavily regulated and restricted in how it markets its products. Volkswagen changed its engineering practices. Wells Fargo restructured its compensation system, and pharmaceutical companies are now far more cautious about making unsupported claims about drug safety. The legal system, while imperfect, has proven capable of holding corporate power accountable, but only when prosecutors, regulators, and citizens demand it. That's why vigilance matters. That's why the cases we discuss here, the verdicts, the settlements, the regulatory changes that follow, matter beyond the courtroom. They shape what corporations think they can get away with. So here's my question for you. As we move through 2026, what corporate crimes do you think are happening right now that we don't know about yet? What companies are running the same cost-benefit calculations that Ford did, that Purdue did, that Wells Fargo did? Comment below with your thoughts, and if you want to see more investigations into corporate crime, corporate fraud, and the verdicts that change industries, subscribe to The Verdict Room. We'll be back next week with another case that will make you question everything you thought you knew about how justice actually works. Thanks for watching.